Welcome to Face2Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face2Face. So my next interview is with Erin Millar. She is the CEO and editor-in-chief of Discourse Media. She's a journalist and an entrepreneur. She's part of the staff there, clearly. And we are about to have a conversation that I'm hoping you're going to take part in that is fascinating on a variety of levels. We talk about innovation and about radical transparency. One of my favorite notions coming out of this interview, this conversation with Erin. We talk about why millennials are kind of the future of what Erin refers to as profitable journalism. We talk about why she's so hopeful about where we're heading in this era of fake news and issues of credibility, and as she says, a crisis of trust. We talk about community engagement and economic potential and investigative journalism, local news, poverty. Fascinating interview. You're gonna want to stay tuned. Don't touch that dial. Coming right up, Erin Millar with Discourse Media. And don't forget, you can also get behind, speaking of new forms of journalism, you can get behind what I'm doing here through patreon.com, and you can come alongside and help support what I'm doing as well there. Would certainly appreciate you checking that out, patreon.com, and davidpecklive.com as well for more information about my speaking and my writing. And of course, don't forget rabble.ca, where you'll find out a whole lot more about what's going on in Canada and around the world. A lot of articles, podcasts, and things to dive deep into. Coming right up, Erin Millar from Discourse Media. Well, welcome to Face2Face. We're joined by a very special guest today. Erin Millar is here from Discourse Media to talk about the media, the state of news and media in general here in Canada. Erin, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
So we have so much to talk about, and I know already, based on what little bit of a conversation that we've had, we're not going to have enough time. So I think I need to book with you part 2 of the interview right now. So maybe we can do that. Tell us a little bit about Discourse and about what you're doing that involves a $1 million investment.
Sure. So Discourse Media is a Vancouver-based digital media company, and we're committed to producing investigative journalism that is community-based. So what we mean by that is, as there's been this decline in media, one of the first things that got cut was investigative journalism. So the sorts of projects that take a lot of research, a lot of data journalism, a lot of time to report on that really reveal something new is how we think about investigative journalism. There's really that tradition that we're trying to bring back, but doing that in a very new digital way, and that's where the community engagement piece comes in. So we're really trying to figure out new ways of bringing our community that are somehow involved in the issue that we're reporting on into our reporting, so that we can be integrating their knowledge, so that we can make sure our reporting is super relevant to what's going on the ground. And we're very lucky to be at this moment in time because there's a lot of new digital tools and technologies that we can use to really do that in new ways. So that's what Discourse is about. And so you asked what we're doing, raising $1 million right now.
That's right.
So,
what are you going to do with $1 million? That's what I want to know. Yeah.
It's a big number. So we're 3.5 years old. And for the first 3 years, we've been really experimenting with ways of doing journalism that can have a larger impact on social issues. That was the goal. And we're now a team of 14 full-time, mostly journalists, doing this work. And we think, we've now won national and international awards for our work. We've attracted this absolutely killer team. And we're reaching, millions of audience members through partnerships with dozens of media outlets around the world, from the Terrace Standard in Northern BC to the New York Times. So we feel like we've really nailed our model, and we have a vision for how we can develop a profitable business model that can enable us to scale nationally, and then eventually scale up by bringing the discourse model to communities where we're seeing that are losing their local community newspapers. But in order to do that, we need money. We've been growing up until now very much just by bootstrapping and borrowing a little bit of money from family and that kind of thing. And we've grown this to the point that we can do within my own economic power. So at this point, we've developed this plan about how we want to bring this national, and we're doing our first external financing in order to enable us to do that.
And you're on a campaign till we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, I suppose, of our chat today, but till the 21st of December, I think, to raise this $1 million.
Yep.
And this is a way for Canadians to get involved.
Yeah. So, when we looked at, what kind of business or what kind of organization did we want to be, we considered being a nonprofit as well, and we've had support from a number of foundations to help get us here. But we felt that we wanted to do this in a business model. And the reason for that is because we believe that that's the vehicle that we can really have the impact that we have the potential to make if we can actually innovate what is a profitable business model that supports public service journalism at this time where advertising revenue is just going through the floor, and nobody has figured out how to make journalism scalable. So we felt that if we could develop that would be a huge contribution to the industry that we would hope would be replicated by other media outlets that were doing different things. So that was really our vision. So that puts us into a very different category in terms of how we raise money. We're not asking for donations. We're asking for investments, and we wanted to ensure that there was a diverse community of shareholders that were part of this investment campaign to keep us honest to our values and our mission, to help us succeed because their interests were aligned with ours, and then to share the benefits when we do succeed. We intend these investments to produce returns for our shareholders in the coming years as we hit profitability and scale this across Canada.
So tell me about what's going on. I mean, we just in the last 24, 36 hours, a pretty crazy announcement coming out from Postmedia and Torstar, and potentially upwards of, I think, 40 local community newspapers being shut down. What's going on out there? I mean, I remember I just sort of fondly reminded of, Egon from Ghostbusters, where he makes the comment, print is dead. I mean, in the film Ghostbusters, is this what this is all about? It's just people aren't buying newspapers. I still like the print version, but tell me more.
Yeah, so I mean, journalism has long been in a subsidization business model, meaning that even when we were at the peak of people buying subscriptions to physical print newspapers, it never paid the full cost of the production of that paper. Most of that was still being paid for by advertising. And print advertising always was valued higher than they've been able to replicate through digital advertising. So that's sort of the one piece that happened as we first started to see the decline, between 10 and 5 years ago, was that transition to digital and seeing that the value of advertising wasn't as high.
Right.
And what's really happened in this most recent contraction of the industry is that the amount of Canadian digital advertising revenue that is now going to the platforms, it's over 70% just to Google and Facebook. So that doesn't even include Twitter or any other platform. That's really made it that's really a tipping point, meaning that the economics are just not there anymore. We can't rely on advertising anymore. So that's what's really behind this latest announcement that we're going to see as many as 40 community newspapers closing between Postmedia and Torstar. And by the last analysis that I heard about of Postmedia's books, predicted that they had 18 months left before they would hit bankruptcy. And that's 250 community newspapers across this country. It's the largest chain in the country. So this is really a really distressing time to be in the industry because newspapers still remain the primary source of original reporting. So that means our communities, local politicians are not being covered. And it's also, the thing that really sickens me about these announced closures is that these communities that no longer have community newspapers really, it's not just about holding power to account, it's also community newspapers have united us. So there was some research that came out by the Knight Commission in the States several years ago studying communities that have lost their community newspaper and what had changed. And what they found was that there was actually more division between neighbors. We're less likely to volunteer. We're less likely to trust our neighbors. We're less likely to vote if there's not a community newspaper. So it's those sorts of impacts that we're really going to see in the next while. And so, it's all the more reason to start really rebuilding something new, and that's what we're trying to do with this.
So tell me about this notion of profitable journalism. That almost sounds in a way oxymoronic, but obviously it probably doesn't sound that way to the journalists and people who are, raising families and trying to get paychecks and so on. But is there, does that bother you in any sense? Does that open you up to some sort of ethical liability down the road?
Well, I actually think the counter to that, I told you a little bit why we chose to do this in a business model as opposed to a nonprofit model. And certainly I'm not, I haven't gotten into the journalism business primarily to make money. Right. There's way easier ways to make money.
Really? Is that, are you sure that, yeah.
But what we saw in the States after, the digital disruption there is a little further along than it is in Canada. And when we were developing our business plan at Discourse, we really studied what was happening in the States and in European markets as well. And what we found was that there was this huge nonprofit news sector that popped up in the States that is doing some really amazing work, like ProPublica and our partner, the Center for Investigative Reporting and the Reveal podcast, for example. And their funding model is essentially that they get small donations, but mostly large foundations giving them grants to do reporting around certain issues. And we don't have the same pile of private money here in Canada that there is in the States, and there's also some other barriers to why we don't see foundation money going into journalism. As much as some CRA rules and stuff that we don't need to talk about, but I think the reality of that is that the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation essentially get to decide what topics are reported on and what are not.
Right.
And yes, these organizations have editorial independence in the stories that they're choosing and all of that at the sort of story and editorial level, but it's still a model that is making the overall industry responsive to the needs of private money as opposed to being responsive to the needs of individuals. So we're trying to do this in a business model that is asking people to pay for this, and we want to do a business model because we want to make it scalable so that we can really have a large impact. So I actually feel that this is more values and mission aligned for me as opposed than doing a different model. So that's why we've chosen to do it this way.
How are millennials changing the way that news is not only? And I'm uncomfortable with even using the phrase "consumed." There was an interesting article recently by Martin Scorsese about film, and he said, movies aren't meant to be consumed; they're meant to be experienced. And I wonder if there's something similar to that about news. And yet, it seems, and even CNN has shifted recently. Their online platform is way more digital. Way more video-based. Something that doesn't really appeal to me. I'd rather read the article. I'd rather read the op-ed than watch a 2.5-minute video. So I'm just, what are young people doing to the landscape?
Yeah, well, one big shift, and this probably does reflect your experience, is also that we're consuming and discovering the content that we're consuming through social platforms as opposed to, going to homepages of publications. Right. So, I used to check the Globe and Mail homepage every 5 minutes. It felt like I don't even think I do it daily anymore. And I'm assuming that I'm going to discover the stories that are most important through Facebook, through Twitter, through the different platforms that I'm just kind of constantly engaged in conversation. And that experience is very much reflects what younger people are doing. I am a millennial, so I'll I include myself in that group. So what that means is that we're consuming media from a lot more sources than we used to, and that has really changed the dynamics of trust in journalism. So millennials are over 60% of our audience falls between 20 and 40. So we think about this group a lot, and They are distrustful of the journalistic process. They do tend to have a little bit more trust in those sort of legacy brands of media, but they still don't really trust them, and they're trying to figure out what to trust. So that's one big thing. Definitely, video is a huge trend right now, and that's being pushed forward by Facebook's algorithms that are really rewarding smart social video production by pushing it forward and getting really broad reach. So that is one thing that we're seeing, but I don't know if that will have staying power. We'll see. But one thing that I have really found interesting is that there was this assumption for many years that younger people weren't willing to engage in content and and either read long form, or whether it's podcast or some other format, weren't willing to do that, and that we had a short attention span and we only wanted to be entertained by cat videos, etc. And actually, that's really not the case. We've seen much more willingness of people, younger people, to be reading long form and stuff like that digitally, particularly as the user experience of mobile phones has improved. So I don't want to sit on my laptop and read a 20,000 word Atlantic feature, but I'll totally lounge on my couch and look at it on my phone if the user experience is good now. So we're finding that, and there was a really recent study that just came out that was sponsored by the Canadian Journalism Foundation that looks specifically at age demographics and consumption habits of Canadians. We don't have that much data about Canadians. That showed that millennials were actually more likely to engage in issue-based, longer form than baby boomers. So I thought that was a really interesting.
That's fascinating. That would totally sort of turn that idea on its head, right?
Exactly. Who has the short attention span?
Yeah. Millennials are all distracted, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we like cat videos, but we also want to consume video, and there's nothing wrong with doing both.
Well,
right?
yeah. So, little style, little substance goes a long way. So you brought up the notion of the issue of trust. I mean, in this age of Donald Trump and fake news, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, by the way. And before we actually hit record, you had made a reference to something you called radical transparency, which I love. Should be the title of your first book that you write, actually, I think. But we live in this era of supposedly fake news. Why would anybody believe anything? Isn't it all spin? Isn't it all just a simulation of the real, of the the authentic?
Yeah, that's a provocative question, and I mean, in a way, I agree with you. I think that one of the things that has damaged the journalism industry's trust with their audience, and I'm a journalist first and foremost. I'm now running a company, but I started this as a journalist, and I think like a journalist. Is the fact that we pretended that there was objectivity, and the voice and the tone of news, the way that we're trained to report, is this sort of authoritative voice of God tone, where it's like, you just have to trust me because I'm the one broadcasting the information that I think that you need, and you just have to trust me that this is accurate and that this is balanced and all of that. And I think what has happened, particularly in the last year and a half, as we saw this really, really damaging presidential campaign and fake news from Russia and all of these things, is that there's been this awareness among people, people who care about issues and care about news, and that's not everyone, of course, but that, hey, we need to value journalism. We need to think differently about it. We need to be thinking critically, and that's led to a lot of focus on how can we build more trust with audiences. And so we at Discourse, we actually think that that's the primary problem that we need to solve for as journalists, and we're doing that by thinking about our voice.
The credibility question.
The credibility question, if we can put forward work that somebody who, particularly because we're a new digital brand, and that's, and it's, people don't know how to judge which digital brands to trust and which not to, that we know if we're going to build credibility with a large enough audience that we're going to be successful, that we need to do it in such a way where you can consume our content and immediately have an idea that you should trust it. So we're doing it by really changing our voice. And as a long-form magazine writer who was trained in the old school, some of this is kind of counterintuitive to me, this idea that we should place ourselves always as journalists in our piece and acknowledge where we're at in our journey of expertise and show how the sausage is made and talk about our sources and be clear about the process and behind journalism and verification, and like what are the limitations of our certainty about things, and why did we choose this source over that source? And so, and you know, it's a careful balancing act, because we also don't want to just be navel gazing. Like nobody needs to hear like all the details of how I do my job, but there are like visual signals and tone signals that we can give to people.
It's so interesting. I mean, it sounds like we're in an ethics class, a philosophy class of years ago, and probably of yesterday too. But just some of those questions that you're asking are so relevant. I have a 10 and a 12-year-old, and watching them grow up with digital in a way that I certainly didn't have, and where will that credibility question for them begin and end, you know, as they continue to not only hopefully become more literate with this stuff, but actually I'm hoping and trusting a little more critical and reflective, and wanting to go a little deeper. And are you hopeful?
I'm totally hopeful. You know, I actually feel more hopeful at this point in time in my career than I have in my entire journalism career.
That's fascinating.
I mean, that might sound insane, because it's like there's like this total crisis happening in media and in politics, but I feel like some of the forces that are just like that have been holding the system back from really like transforming are at tipping points. You know, like that stat I mentioned earlier about advertising. Like advertising incentive model is just like completely messed everything up, because what it did was it incentivized editors and journalists and content creators to treat their audience as like the source of eyeballs to sell to advertisers, and the incentives were just so upside down, where, you know, it was better off to trick somebody into clicking on something, even if you know, if you ever clicked on a headline, you're like, this article isn't even about this, you know.
Right. Yes.
That's how we got to a crisis in trust, or that like really formulaic stuff that, you know, is just clickbait and all of that. So this is starting to fall away, and we're really going to see like a really fundamental shift as revenue strategies are moving away from advertisers to asking for audiences to pay for things, and audiences are more willing to pay for things because of this crisis of politics, because now they say, oh wait, we need to value this. And, you know, we're seeing now at the New York Times that almost 60% of their revenue is coming from their audience as opposed to advertisers.
Right.
The Globe and Mail is now over 50%. And I think that's exciting, because that means that media has to stop and say, hey, like, how do I create real value for the consumers of this, as opposed to how do I create value for advertisers? And those are very, very different things.
It's amazing that you are so hopeful. I mean, you can really hear it in your voice, and you're clearly passionately committed to the cause and to moving this whole thing forward, which I think is just remarkable. And what I love about what all of you guys do is it's about the conversation. It's about the dialogue. It's about asking questions. And isn't that really what good journalism or great journalism is all about? Tell us, just as we wrap up here, sadly we have to go, what can we do again? We can invest, minimum investment's $250. How can we go about doing that?
Yeah, so we are on we're on a platform called Front Funder. So that's Front Funder with only an R at the end, not an ER, you know, new digital name. And you can find Discourse Media on there and invest through that process. It's a little bit more complicated than Kickstarter, because you're actually an investor and a shareholder. You have to go through a process. We don't see any of that data, though. And also, if you're in Vancouver, we're doing a really interesting event on December 7th, next Thursday, in conversation with a celebrated U.S. media critic, Jay Rosen. We'll be talking about this crisis of trust and why it's one of the most exciting times to be innovating in media.
Amazing. Well, listen, thanks for your time today. We've been chatting with Erin Millar. She's the CEO and editor-in-chief of Discourse Media, a journalist, and I would say a passionate and committed entrepreneur. Erin, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much. I'm going to let you go. Okay, bye-bye.